Staying with that story, let's speak to University of Pretoria African Centre for the Study of the United States Director, Professor Christopher Isike, and Institute for Global Dialogue Senior Researcher, Mikatekiso Kubayi. Now, remember to send us your comments and questions on WhatsApp 072-110-5584 or call us on 010-594-6010. You can also engage with us on X at Newzroom 405. Professor Isike, let me start off with you. Now, let's talk about how you would frame the current state of US-South Africa relations. Are we in a good place? Are we in a good position? What's likely to come post this United Nations General Assembly?
Well, good evening and thank you for having me. The relationship has been, very tense in the last couple of months, especially since President Trump's return to office. There's been some kind of stalemate between both. They are working things out as they claim on both sides, especially on the South African side. However, there's a sense in which many would say that President Ramaphosa's address to the United Nations General Assembly in many ways would, raise tensions between both countries, especially when you look at his talk about his reference to, to big countries using trade as a weapon, of diplomacy instead of, against multilateralism, those kinds of talk. And then, of course, he talked a lot about the Palestinian case and self-determination, which are things that this current administration strongly oppose. Look, if the U.S. president was to listen to that speech, or even Marco Rubio, and analyze it, the opposition would be that there's a bit of gloating there, and that it will only help to serve to actually worsen the tension between both countries. But of course, the United Nations General Assembly is not a place for countries to come talk about what they have done in their countries for their people. It should be more about, it's supposed to be a multilateral forum that speaks to how countries can contribute to global governance to solve, global challenges. And this is where the speech or the address of the United States president is actually very troubling.
Mr. Kubayi, same issue, right? Ibrahim Rasool was expelled as the last ambassador to the United States in March of this year. South Africa does not have a substantive ambassador to the United States at the moment. President Cyril Ramaphosa has been speaking out on a number of issues which are potentially contrary to what Donald Trump is saying. Where does that leave South Africa?
Well, South Africa is essentially in the same place that many other countries are. On the issue of using trade as a weapon, it's no different to what Donald Trump himself has said, as an instrument to use to punish others, whether be it Russia, be it India for buying Russian oil, or any other state, for that matter, including China, and so on, and certainly. Europe, has also, had its fair share, of issues, with United States tariffs. So where the whole world, has issues, with President Trump's, strategy, of using tariffs, to conduct diplomacy, if you like. And some may even argue that, look, tariffs are just, another way of expressing, the sheer muscle, sheer power, raw power, that the United States actually has. Some, for example, have even said, on the issue, for example, of the Middle East, and whatnot, countries acknowledging Palestine and so on, that, the fact that they all have done that and nothing is changing shows that the United States is still, the power that actually matters. And this is something that one saw, in BBC, for example, being reported there. And that's what this is. I mean, a flexing, of muscle, to get what they want. They want to essentially, change the way, global trade is conducted. There's an argument has been made that, look, they want to reindustrialize the United States, but deindustrializing the United States, wasn't, the fault of anybody but, U.S. policymakers. They allowed, for that, to happen. They themselves, took industry elsewhere, seeking cheaper labor and so on and so forth. So it's not the fault, of the rest of the world that, the United States actually deindustrialized. It's not the fault of the rest of the world, that they invested heavily, on the financial markets, because, it's easier, more secure to make money, in that particular fashion rather than investing in the real economy. It's not the fault of the rest of the world that they, allowed heavy financialization to take foot, in the U.S. economy. But, the rest of the world is being punished, for policy missteps, of successive, U.S. administrations. So yes, South Africa is essentially in the same place, that many other countries, are in. So whether be it, on the issue of, describing the tariff issue as it is, or, politically the issue of, Palestine, now understand about 150 countries, have, recognized Palestine, as a state.
So earlier we were speaking to Simon Marks, and he suggested that potentially the United States may not be listening to what President Cyril Ramaphosa has said. But it's one of the conversations or one of the questions, Professor Isike, that I'd like us to talk about in a moment when we come back from the break. You're watching Newsfeed PM, the late edition. A lot more to look forward to around this engagement around the United Nations 80th General Assembly when we return. Thank you for staying with us. We're discussing the state of South Africa-United States relations, and I have University of Pretoria African Centre for the Study of the United States Director Professor Christopher Isike and Institute for Global Dialogue Senior Researcher Mikatekiso Kubayi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with us. Professor, let's go back to this situation where President Cyril Ramaphosa has spoken out on a number of issues, not just defending Africa, but he's also defended Cuba and called for an end to those sanctions, if you will, sooner rather than later. Would Donald Trump take exception to the position that President Cyril Ramaphosa has on this issue and a number of other issues?
Oh, yes, he would. Like I said before, if he listened to the speech, he would take exception to a number of things. But again, like our other panelists said, this is really not just America versus South Africa issue. It's America versus the rest of the world. Of course, President Ramaphosa, strategically positioned South Africa as a voice for the global South. Framing South Africa as rightful interlocutors, not just passive recipients. He evoked the moral weight of international law and multilateral ideals. Giving a very comprehensive agenda by not shying away from core issues like the Gaza one, the need for us to move away from unilateralism, climate equity, and the Cuba issue, like you mentioned. And this is opposite to what President Trump was doing. His speech was not just performative, but it was a strong repudiation of multilateralism, which is at the very heart of global governance. By Trump reframing sovereignty as nationalism, migration as an invasion, and climate cooperation as fraudulent, he articulated a worldview in which the United Nations is not going to be seen as a forum for peace, but as a foe of sovereignty, and this is a problem, because it raises the question, a serious question about global governance. Is it going to fragment, or do we move away from global governance and begin to move into an era where right is might and strong countries would dominate? Where would that leave us, considering the history of of the world, in those times where we had, even a multipolar world, not to talk of when we went into a bipolar world order. The world is increasingly becoming multiplex, various currencies of powers, everyone contributing one way or another. But it raises questions about whether, like Trump rightly said, the efficacy of the United Nations. Do we keep it as it is, or do we begin to think about, really actively, reforming it? And maybe one of the things we should do is to take it away from New York and take it to Geneva. The whole idea of refusing Palestinians to attend this particular summit is actually an abuse of the privilege of hosting the United Nations in New York.
Well, it does raise the question about those 5 or 6 nations that have the veto powers, right? As to whether they would agree, because they seem to hold all the power. But Mr. Kubayi, let's talk a couple of issues here. Now, I want to touch on the significance of South Africa hosting this year's G20 and it coming to Africa for the very first time. How much power does Cyril Ramaphosa and South Africa hold in addressing any number of issues? The one thing that President Ramaphosa talked about the Global Inequality Report, which will be presented for the first time, if you will, at the G20, in which Donald Trump is sending his Vice President, J.D. Vance. Sorry, Mr. Kubayi, you're muted, sir. You're going to have to start your answer.
Apologies for that. Obviously, the G20 is a very important, institution, if you like. It was originally created to, look at, purely financial matters, the global financial architecture, liquidity, in the global markets, and so on. It's the United States itself, actually, that elevated it to summit level, George Bush, for that matter. And, it has since then, taken up, a whole range, a much expanded, portfolio of issues, to consider. The fact that you have it in South Africa is, a positive, for the Global South. It's a positive for the Global South, because you now have, a succession of 4 Global South presidencies, of the G20. I mean, an opportunity for 4 years in a row to place issues of the Global South, right at the center of the agenda, global agenda, for all of these, major economies to actually engage with. Right? We often talk about, Africa not having as big a voice, and so on and so forth. This is an opportunity, for Africa's voice, as well to be elevated, for Africa to be heard, as well. It's certainly, an opportunity to try and consolidate, the gains, of these successive Global South presidencies. It's a big deal. The hosting, the presidency of the Global South, the presidency of the G20, by South Africa. It is a significant thing.
Yeah, but Mr. Kubayi, sorry, allow me to come in there. I mean, yes, we talk about it being a massive deal, but let's talk to the practicality of it, right? Because there are a number of issues that were talked about, and as far as the United Nations is concerned, where policy is discussed, but the issue is around implementation. What are we going to do when it comes to the practical steps to translate what is a huge issue into actual power moves?
Okay, you see, that's a very important question, because it speaks to how the G20 actually functions, and what it was meant to actually, do. Firstly, the G20 is, an institution, a forum, that, whose declarations are actually non-binding, on member states, right? It's a platform, it's a forum, for these states, to come together and agree, on coordination, of policy positions or policy actions in their respective, economies, in their respective states, to try and guide, a global response in a particular agreed, direction, and so on. Now, it may well be, I mean, there are many declarations of previous G20s, that have not come to light, that have not come to, fruition, that have not been implemented. Right? There is no obligation for any member state of the G20 to implement anything, that the G20, agrees. However, what the G20, its core advantage, is that here you have, under, the same roof, leaders of the major economies of the world, more than 70% of global GDP, under the same roof, discussing, issues, and by the way, in full view of the entire globe.
Yeah,
right?
Mr. Kubayi,
So
I'm afraid we've run short of time, but it's been great having this conversation, and certainly something that we want to speak to again. Mikatekiso Kubayi, appreciate your time. Professor Christopher Isike, great to have you on the show today as we unpack those issues post the remarks by President Cyril Ramaphosa at the 80th United Nations General Assembly currently taking place in the United States. Your headlines coming up, top of the hour. Don't go away.